For the first time, the FBI developed and operated its own hardened encrypted device company called Anom, A-N-O-M. As we allege in our indictment, criminal organizations and the individual defendants that we have charged purchased and distributed Anom devices in an effort to secretly plan and execute their crime.
In the time the FBI's Anom platform has been up and running since October of 2019 till now, we have had more than 12,000 devices sending more than 27 million messages across more than 100 countries in over 45 different languages.
Joseph Cox, award-winning investigative journalist and co-founder of 404 Media, is here to talk about his new book, Dark Wire, the incredible true story of the largest sting operation ever, which is also being adapted into a Netflix film directed by Jason Bateman. Thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us today.
Of course, very, very happy to be here.
If someone read your book or heard this story, you would think this whole thing, instead of being a true story, was fiction, and that this is like something you would see in a Hollywood movie, and that maybe that's why Netflix is adapting it into a film on Netflix with Jason Bateman. But basically, I'm just going to kind of give viewers the very quick summary, and we can get into the details. So basically, the FBI in the United States of America and the Australian Federal Police secretly created an encrypted phone company called Anom. Then they had some shady sellers sell these phones exclusively to other shady figures. At one point, there's over 12,000 of these phones to over 300 criminal enterprises in over 100 different countries. So basically, you have an FBI starting a company just to basically wiretap the criminals of the world. And in one sense, it's genius. In another sense, it raises all sorts of privacy issues, which of course we could get to later. But just for the average person that hasn't heard this story, and obviously the Netflix film isn't out yet, so just give us your synopsis and your summary, the quick summary of the book.
Yeah, you're right in that it's almost stranger than fiction. And that was my response when I first learned about this operation, which was at the same time as everyone else, which was June 2021 when the FBI came clean and revealed they'd been running Anom. I did not expect the FBI to go this far. They had shut down companies. European authorities had hacked companies as well, which is all detailed in the book. But then I didn't anticipate the FBI would say, let's make a tech startup for criminals, essentially. And I think your summary of it was really good. All I would add is that I tell the story from the perspective of both the authorities, so the FBI and European authorities, the Dutch and the Swedish police as well. I actually went into the rooms in the San Diego FBI field office where they read the Anom messages, and I walked through those and I spoke to the agents involved. But I also tell it from the perspective of the criminals and of the people selling these phones, who are often criminals as well. There's a lot of overlap there. But that's sort of where I come to this story from. I've spoken to criminals for the majority of my career. That's like my entire thing, is speaking to drug traffickers, hackers, cyber criminals, anyone it may be. But here I managed to get both sides, and of course they very dramatically intertwine when the FBI does eventually shut down Anom. And all I would add on sort of the summary is that it got too big. Anom was a victim of his own success. You mentioned 12,000 phones. The FBI was getting something like 1 million messages a day near the end of the operation, all of which had to be read, all of which had to be analyzed for potential, not just drug trafficking, but threats to life. You know, people were potentially going to get very, very hurt, the users of this app or who the users targeted, and it just became far too much to handle.
I've read that there's 27 million total messages. You're talking about, in the book about the hockey stick. I mean, a lot of those messages were coming towards the end. They would have been in the millions per day if they would have kept this up. I mean, the FBI got, was it Sky essentially shut down? And and then was it ECNO? How do you pronounce it? EncroChat?
EncroChat. Yeah, they all have these weird, stupid names.
Right, but they were going out, like wasn't just the feds in the U.S., but you had Europol and you had Australia and you had other federal policing agencies. They were sitting there colluding against these other private companies to get them shut down on purpose because they knew everyone would then go to Anom.
Yeah, there are basically three major, not plot points, but sort of points in the growth of Anom. And the first is obviously when it starts, and it's just a handful of devices sort of being traded by hand of mouth in Australia, where it starts initially. It moves to Europe, thanks to Hakan Ayik, a very big drug trafficker who I'm sure we'll get into. And then, as you say, the European authorities hack another phone company called Sky, and this was a massively popular one among drug traffickers. At the same time, the FBI and US authorities indict the owner of Sky, and that causes a mass migration, an exodus of users from Sky over to Anom, where, of course, the FBI is waiting. Now, I'm sure that legitimate tech companies like Facebook or whoever, I bet they would love to be able to shut down their rivals and absorb their user base. Obviously, they can't do that. The DOJ is different in that they're a law enforcement agency, and they can play these games to inflate the user base of their own encrypted messaging company.
This whole thing is about encrypted phone. I think we should maybe kind of talk a little bit about the encrypted phones. Recently, we had the CEO of Telegram that was arrested in France, and that is an app that has something like 900 million active daily users. So, how would Anom differ from something like Telegram?
Yeah, so you kind of have to go back maybe 10, maybe 15 years. And I know that sounds boring, like a history lesson, but I'll do it rapidly, and it is actually pretty exciting. It starts with Blackberries, where these encrypted phone companies would take a Blackberry, with the old school QWERTY keyboard. They would take that device, they'd remove the microphone, the GPS, the camera, and basically all of this hardware stuff, and then just put an encrypted email messaging program onto the phone. At the end of the day, it's actually not really much of a phone at all. It's like a portable encrypted email device. Those were popular for a while. Then Android came along and the companies moved over to there. Some, like Sky, actually put their messaging apps onto iPhones as well. But it's not just the encryption itself. What will happen with these phone companies is that if your device lands in the wrong hands, let's say, presumably police or the FBI, you can go to Phantom Secure or EncroChat or Sky and say, please wipe my phone, it's in very bad hands, and then they'll automatically delete all of the data on it. That's different to iCloud in that you'll log into the iCloud interface, right, and you will decide, I'm going to wipe my phone because somebody robbed me on the street and stole my device. This is different in that the company is actively involved in wiping data that could thwart law enforcement, and that really annoyed the authorities, and is part of why they went against it, against the industry writ large. So, to answer your question about how it's different from Telegram, it has a lot of the features of Telegram with encrypted messaging and that sort of thing. There's a much more all-encompassing solution for people who are trying to avoid having their communications land in the hands of law enforcement, essentially.
You mentioned this Phantom Secure, which was one of the biggest encryption phones that was based in Canada. Then you have the CEO charged in the US, even though the guy never really did any business in the US under RICO acts. And he's still to this day in prison. I think he got sentenced to like 9 years. And then you mentioned in the book, like how, for a traditional startup, like this startup is way more complex because you have to navigate all these other countries' legislations. In the US, essentially, the FBI was the hub of it, that they had their own tech department and things like that. But essentially, they had to partner up with Lithuania, a country in Europe, because due to regulations in the EU, the US couldn't really spy on the people in Europe. They needed to get a partner. A lot of the other countries in Europe didn't want to do it. And then Australia could somehow spy on the US. So then the US could then get that information from Australia, but the US couldn't actually look at the people in the US because of regulation. I mean, this whole thing is like, like the tech side seems easy. And I kind of asked you a lot of questions there, but you can just take this any way you want.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the fact that you laid it out and it sounds so messy and complicated, I think exactly proves the point, right? In that they have this idea for, let's make an encrypted phone, let's put a backdoor in it, and then we can read all of the messages, and that would be amazing. Okay, that's good. Let's sort out the tech. I mean, it's not trivial, but it's also not the hardest thing in the world. You just BCC the messages to a ghost contact, essentially, and that's what they ended up doing. The hard part is the legality, and that's really, really difficult. For the Australian authorities in Australia, they recently passed a new surveillance law at the time, and that allowed them to do this sort of thing, and so it was kind of straightforward for them. For the Americans, the FBI, it was a lot more tricky. If they were going to look at phones inside the US, that would be a ton of paperwork. And to be clear, I think that's a good thing. I think there should be a barrier of entry to getting a wiretap order on somebody. You need to have a court order, probable cause, whatever it may be. I mean, there's different mechanisms, right? But like, there needs to be friction because otherwise it's going to be abused. But that being said, the FBI can look at phones overseas. So they basically worked out this very strange relay race where, as you say, the data from the Anom phones, the FBI's startup, goes to Lithuania, they repackage the data, and they then get sent to the FBI with basically no strings attached, because the way they've received it is by using something called an MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Don't really need to get on what that is, but it's basically a nice little agreement where you get a nice little package of data and you can do whatever you want with it. That being said, the FBI really did want to look at phones in America, and they tried. They applied for those wiretap orders I mentioned, the sort of boilerplate language you're going to need to get through, and they were never approved because clearly there was tension inside the US with the San Diego people wanting to do it, and then people in DC or elsewhere being like, we don't want to authorize this. And I think that just adds another layer of complexity of like, people think, oh, the FBI is like a monolithic entity. No, there's pushing and pulling in there constantly, with some people wanting to do these very audacious operations and other people wanting to, play it safe. Because this was not playing it safe. This was incredibly risky. People could die, theoretically, and in at least one case I confirmed that they actually did. They were assassinated due to plans orchestrated across the FBI's own app. And I mean, that brings up all sorts of questions of, did the FBI fail in that case? Should they have done this? It's a very, very complicated discussion that we couldn't have before because nobody knew about it. That's why I wrote the book.
There's so many outrageous stories in here. What is the most outrageous story? You're talking about hackers, and we got money launderers, and we got contract killers, and some of the biggest drug dealers in the world. And like you're mentioning, these people aren't measuring cocaine in kilos, they're measuring it in tons. I mean, you're talking about some of the biggest kingpins of the underworld in the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most crazy stories for me, and I got this somewhat relatively late in the reporting and the writing process, was how when Sky went down, and all of these drug traffickers were moving over to Anom, the FBI's phone, they were running out of stock. There were literally too few Google Pixel phones to load the software onto. So the FBI decided to intervene in a particularly interesting way. They loaded duffel bags full of Google Pixel phones onto a Gulfstream jet in DC, flew it over to the Netherlands, where they unloaded it on an airfield, and the way it was described to me, it sounds like they basically got past Dutch customs with these phones. They then gave those to local authorities who left them at a dead drop, and phone sellers for Anom picked them up and continued to sell phones to the criminal underworld, all without knowing that the FBI had just given them the stock of phones to do so. And that was so surprising and crazy to me, because when the FBI first came out and took credit for running this company, it was very much framed as, oh, we were hands off, we just made it and then the criminals did all the work for us. They sold the phones, we just read the messages. It's not that simple. The FBI did intervene, and they did inflate the stock, and they did allow these phones to spread much more rapidly and successfully than if they had been completely hands off.
Well, the way you laid it out, one of the questions I kind of have is, I mean, ultimately, is this a good thing or a bad thing? You certainly brought up some privacy issues, but in your epilogue of the book, you mentioned about how Yeah, they got, was it over, essentially between all these encrypted phone companies, or something like 10,000 arrests and close to $1 billion in cash. That's not even assets, right? That's just in cash. You're talking tons of drugs off the street. They prevented a bunch of murders in actual, pretty much real time. But once this shut down in 2021, and at least in Europe, a lot of the murders are back up. The drugs are flowing in. Like, it really didn't have any sizable dent. And I think anytime you're talking about the drug market where you have so much money in it, if you get rid of one kingpin, you're going to have 10 people trying to take their place anyways.
I don't think anybody would argue that arresting 10,000 very, very serious criminals and seizing all their drugs is a bad thing. I think, generally speaking, people would probably be like, oh, that's probably what police should do. And I even say that as somebody who is very skeptical of the war on drugs in general, and privacy implications everything comes with that. I think that's fairly uncontroversial to say. But as you mentioned, the lasting impact, it's just not as significant. I was genuinely shocked when I asked a Swedish official who's involved in the operation afterwards, just asking, like, well, what's the fallout been from all of these operations? And she said, well, the cocaine just keeps coming. Like, there's still tons and tons of coke on ships or however it's being transported. And she, to my surprise, said, maybe we just have to think about how we're policing this more generally, which she didn't say, like, decriminalization or legalization. She's a police officer. I don't think it's her job to make a policy comment. She's more making an enforcement one. Like, after all this, the drugs are still here, And you don't really hear that from British police in my instance, but it was very shocking hearing somebody who was very senior in this Anom operation acknowledge that maybe the impact wasn't all that big at the end of the day. That being said, it's probably not fair to say, oh, look, Anom didn't solve drugs forever, so it was a failure. I mean, it wasn't a failure, but it's definitely it's not a slam dunk as much as the authorities would like you to believe. What I would say is that the real lasting impact is less on the drug side and is much more on technology and the privacy side, where people I speak to now, drug traffickers and people who sell phones or buy the phones as well, they say everybody is paranoid about these phones now. And then that means more people move to Telegram or they move to Signal. And of course, that brings up other questions of, well, what's going to happen to those apps next?
You were kind of mentioning policy. I'll just kind of read this quote from your book, but your quote is, what the Anom and related operations have ushered in is an entirely new way of investigating organized crime, one that brings up questions of privacy, or, is it privacy in England?
I say privacy.
Oh, we're both on the same page then. Proportionality, technology, and legality, with very little to no discussion of whether law enforcement agencies should carry out these types of bulk interception operations. And like you mentioned, like, there was really no debates going on, right? They basically, the FBI and the Australian federal police basically decided this. They found a little country in Lithuania to partner up with it, and everyone else in the world be damned. All their rights be damned, kind of.
Yeah, and it's also the same when the French military police hacked into EncroChat, one of those other companies we mentioned. They hacked into tens of thousands of phones globally. It wasn't just phones inside France. They had to they decided to do all of the devices at once. And that actually included at least one lawyer I spoke to who, to be clear, is not suspected of any criminal conduct. His only quote-unquote crime is providing legal counsel to alleged criminals. And no matter who the criminal is, everyone is entitled to legal defense. I think that's a very basic tenet of the justice system, right? So that was a very broad hacking operation. And again, there was no real debate there. I don't remember the French military police saying, by the way, is it okay if we do this? Even in vague terms. That also applies to Sky, which was also hacked by European authorities as well. And of course, as you mentioned, the Anom operation. And obviously, I'm not expecting law enforcement agencies to say, by the way, here's this very sensitive operation we're about to do. We're going to tell you about it. I just mean more generally, there needs to be a debate around whether we're okay with law enforcement doing these massive interception, bulk collection operations, which absolutely do have the potential for collateral surveillance, as I basically call it, like that lawyer I mentioned his messages were swept up as well, even though he's not suspected of a crime. It's like, are we okay with authorities sweeping up the messages of people who actually aren't connected to criminal activity if it means they do get the top tier drug traffickers? And I'm not actually even trying to suggest that I know the answer, or even I'm not pretending to even have the answer either. I just think like we need to talk about this, because otherwise law enforcement are just going to go and do it. They already did it 3 times.
We often hear about like founder mode. How did the FBI actually do about running this company? And were they running a profitable company? And how did it not leak out that the FBI was actually in charge of this company?
I mean, that's the really funny thing. They were running a tech company. They had to get Amazon servers, I think Google Cloud as well. They had to get the hardware, as I mentioned, eSIMs as well, which allowed the drug traffickers to communicate wherever they were. You had to have constant uptime for this network as well. Like if you're trying to run a secure network, it has to be pretty reliable anyway. Now imagine running a secure network for criminals. They want a good product. They're paying a lot of money for this, hundreds if not thousands of dollars for a 6 or a 12-month subscription, which comes to the profitability. The FBI would never tell me exactly how much money they made. It was basically the one thing they would not tell me, even when I asked multiple times in my calls with them. But what they did describe is that the money would go from the individual users to the resellers to then people higher up in Anom, until eventually to the FBI, where it would be reinvested into the company. It's just smart business sense, right? You take your revenue and then your profits and you put some of them back into the firm, and they were doing all of that. And they scaled. They scaled just like any other tech company, but there's that constant tension, which again comes to a head when they have to shut the company down, in that they want to be successful, but not too successful. And that's not just because of the reason I mentioned where they'd be swimming in too much data, but what happens if this sort of normal people start to get these phones? That would be really, really bad. And in some rare instances, it did land in the hands of civilians. At least that was indicated to me.
One of the major themes of your book was that having this encrypted network that had some of the biggest underworld kingpins using this almost exclusively, it gave the authorities a huge big picture that they never really would have thought. And as you mentioned before, where there was multiple encrypted phones in the book, you're like, maybe you have the production side of drugs is on one encrypted phone, then maybe the distribution side of things is on another encrypted phone. So they never really had the whole picture. Then once the FBI basically got all these other encrypted phones shut down, everyone was forced to go to Anom. Now all of a sudden, the entire picture becomes clear because they're having every aspect of the vertical integration is now fully exposed.
Yeah, it's interesting because back in the day of when encrypted phone companies first started, some of them could speak to one another, mostly because they were just using PGP email, which stands for pretty good privacy, just adds a layer of end-to-end encryption to emails. A real pain in the ass to use. I say that as someone who taught myself to use it and all that sort of thing. And of course, companies like Phantom Secure made it easier for these drug traffickers. But what these companies realized was that being able to connect between networks was actually bad for business. You wanted to make a closed network because then everybody would have to move over to your phone platform. Say you're a big time drug trafficker at the top of your pyramid. If you were using the phone, everybody else underneath you has to use a Phantom or a Sky or whatever. So that's why the encrypted phone companies did it. The side effect of that, as you say, is that you almost have these compartmentalized silos around the world. The money launderers might be on Sky, while as the people taking the drugs off the shipping container in Antwerp or wherever are on EncroChat. And often people will buy multiple phones. I mean, I've seen a photo of one of the money launderers I talk about in the book called Abdullah Izzeldin, and he's in a gym, crouched down in a squat, and he has something like 3 mobile phones on the floor of the gym, and he's like just flicking through them, because that's what you have to do when you're managing across these different networks. But as you say, it was better for the FBI when everybody moved to Anom. And to be fair, it was probably better for the users as well. They didn't have to carry around a small bag of mobile phones in their pockets or whatever. But that opened them up, of course, to much more surveillance because all of their operations were now Anom, or at least a much larger percentage of them.
Did they get any insights into what was going on in the United States? You mentioned the U.S. really couldn't do anything because of their their privacy laws. But then you were mentioning that Australia was kind of being able to look at it, but they maybe weren't able to necessarily act on that information. But did that kind of give them, because you don't really talk, I mean, most of this stuff really takes place in Europe in the book, and in Australia as well.
Yeah, so Australian authorities, as I said, the FBI couldn't look at phones in America because that would be a bureaucratic nightmare. The Australians were allowed to look at phones in the US, but only for threats to life. Where it was like, okay, if somebody is about to die or get assassinated, the Australians could tell the FBI. I never heard about cases of that actually happening. I do know that Anom phones did land in America because I've seen the spreadsheets which show the shipments of phones around the world to various different countries and physical addresses and postboxes. So I know that's the case for sure. That being said, again, the FBI really, really did want it, and it really annoyed a lot of the law enforcement officials working on this case, especially Andrew Young, who was the main prosecutor for sort of the bulk of the operation. He was, once it was all set up in Australia and worldwide and going, he was actively trying to get it working in America, and he eventually quit because there were just so many bureaucratic roadblocks to be able to surveil people in America. And he thinks that if that had been the case, maybe there would have been another 500 simultaneous arrests in the US during the big day of raids in June 2021. I think the San Diego FBI probably sees it as a missed opportunity. I am sure operations like this are happening. We actually saw a week or two ago that there was another encrypted phone company called Ghost the authorities hacked as well. The FBI was somewhat involved in that, but they didn't mention any arrests. But I can definitely see in the future the FBI might continue to try to get access to phones in the US. That being said, actually anecdotally, I have heard that criminals in the States do use a lot more commercial apps like Signal and Telegram. So maybe they don't actually have as much a pressing need as other authorities, because the phones are a scourge, as it was described to me in Australia, and they are the backbone of organized crime in Europe as well.
Anom was essentially like a honeypot. And you just mentioned about how the FBI hacked into another, you just mentioned that, but how common is this? Tor, which is an anonymous web browser, was created by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. You mentioned Bitcoin quite a bit in the book, which we can get to, but the actual cryptographic hash function, SHA-256, was developed by the NSA, or the National Security Agency in the USA. And some people think that Bitcoin could have been created by the CIA or some other global intelligence agency, which I think is likely and would be ironic for the people that think that they're
they're avoiding the government by making a completely traceable network of all their paint. Right. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist with the Bitcoin one, but the fact is we all know that Tor was created by the U.S. Navy. There's no disputing that. So how common are these honeypots, whether globally or even at a smaller scale?
Yeah, I guess just first on sort of the Tor stuff, you're right. And I think it sort of goes back to the point I made earlier about, some people in the FBI really wanted this and others, DOJ in Washington, tried to basically shut it down. There are so many different pushing and pulling motivations inside government. And yes, the Navy was the initial creator and researcher and funder of Tor, right? And then you look through some of the Edward Snowden slides from 2013, and the NSA is complaining that they hate Tor because it's really effective at hiding traffic. Now, that's not to say that that will never change. There was actually recently an attack on hidden services coming out of Germany that was apparently used to de-anonymize people using Ricochet, which is sort of an encrypted chat platform that uses Tor. I'm still looking to some of the specifics about that, but my point is that it's messy. And just because one part of the government funded something doesn't mean it really annoys the other part of the government. You really have to drill down to the specifics. That being said, They're not exactly open about the specifics, right? The governments are particularly secretive with a lot of this tech stuff. On the honeypot thing, it's actually, I would say maybe it's not uncommon. It's increasingly common. That's how I would phrase it. And I would point to a few examples. The first was, when the CIA took over an encryption machine, and they were an encryption company, and they were able to, read messages that way. You have Anom, obviously. You then have some much smaller operations, which I don't think I even mentioned in the book because there was too much material to include. But the DEA at one point, they had some encrypted BlackBerries, and they got the keys to this selection of BlackBerries, and then they handed them out to drug dealers. So it was almost like a Anom on a much, much smaller scale, like to target an individual drug gang, stuff like that. I think it is an increasingly popular tactic because it relies on something very, very important, which is trust. And these drug traffickers, they're not cryptographers. They're not even really technologists in a lot of cases. They don't understand how the tech works. All they know is that they are deciding to put their trust into this piece of technology, maybe because another drug trafficker said they should do it, or somebody convinced them it's very, very good. And what law enforcement and intelligence agencies are doing is flipping that trust as the weapon that's then actually going to take these criminals down. It all relies upon trust, essentially.
If you're a good investigator, what's one of the big expressions is just follow the money. And as you mentioned before, you had this big picture view. So you really saw how the money laundering was going on in real time. And I'm not sure if people are necessarily familiar with the Hawala system, but you talk about that. But then you also talk about how they're now using Bitcoin. There's obviously other cryptocurrencies, but you really mentioned and focused on Bitcoin. So can you, has Bitcoin kind of changed the whole money laundering game, and kind of just give us the big picture view? Because that has to be one of the most important aspects, right? If people aren't making money because you can't get access to it, I mean, what's the point of risking your life and going to prison?
Yeah, exactly. So as I said, I come from sort of the world of covering cybercrime a lot. So that's hackers, that's people who perform ransomware, which is where they'll lock down computers of companies, less so individuals and even hospitals, that sort of thing, and demand cryptocurrencies, primarily Bitcoin, simply because it is easier to get for the layperson than, say, Monero. Because it's all well and good if you would like to use a more privacy-centric cryptocurrency, but if the poor old person you've hacked can't buy it, you're not going to get any money. So it's a little bit complicated there. The reason I bring this up is because cryptocurrency is obviously completely key to ransomware and key to cybercrime today, has been for a very long time. When I was reading through the Anom messages, the Sky, the EncroChat one, which I've obtained hundreds of thousands of messages I must have read at this point, I was genuinely blown away by the amount, by the frequency that Bitcoin was mentioned in there. I knew that some drug traffickers use Bitcoin here and there. I heard the Sinaloa drug cartel used it a little bit, and I was like, that's probably a side thing. That was my interpretation. I don't think they're moving massive amounts of cash there. I was basically wrong in that they are using Bitcoin primarily on a massive scale. And in part, I don't think it's because of the anonymity. I don't think it's that, because they still need to cash out sometimes, and they can find ways to cash out anonymously. For me, I think it's much more the near instant. We all know Bitcoin's not instant. It takes a while to confirm and that sort of thing. But it can be pretty quick. But it's that near instant transfer of wealth across borders. And you don't have to touch a bank account. You don't have to go see somebody necessarily. You can just do wallet to wallet. And these drug traffickers are using that. Now, that doesn't make me think, oh, Bitcoin's bad or anything like that. I definitely think it has created the ransomware industry. That couldn't exist without that sort of payment system. But here's just another way that tool is being used, I think, in a very, very surprising way. And you brought up the Hawala system, which is a little bit complicated. I'll just try to define very briefly in that you have these underground bankers, and they don't have formal bank accounts, Lloyds or TD or whatever, they basically have a little spreadsheet on their phone or their computer. You give them money, they update your account. And then if you want to withdraw $20,000 in Colombia, they have a safe house full of money over there that you can withdraw and then give to your people. It's basically like a second shadow banking system, and that will continue to be massively important as well. There's also a Chinese equivalent, which is like heavily involved in the trade of fentanyl and other chemicals from China into the US and vice versa. Hawala will continue to be important, but Bitcoin, and I'm sure people would disagree with me in this, and that's fine to do, but I almost describe Bitcoin as like the digital equivalent of Hawala, in that you can have this very quick international exchange of wealth. And yeah, I was blown away by the amount of cryptocurrency that was in here. Just wallet after wallet, the QR codes, people transferring it, people asking for a deposit of Bitcoin for drugs. It was fascinating.
What percent of the Bitcoin transactions you think would be considered part of the quote unquote dark web?
I mean, I think that's just far too difficult for me to say. I imagine that firms like Chainalysis, which is one of these companies that follows the blockchain, maybe they would have some sort of insight into that. I would say that its use has only increased over the 10 years that I've been covering digital crime, cybercrime, and drug trafficking as well. That may sound obvious, but I think it's really interesting how it has bled over from cybercrime to, I don't know, analog crime, traditional crime, for lack of a better way of putting it. It's like even relatively low-level drug distributors in the UK are using Bitcoin. Like, it's not just big guys. It's big guys, small guys. It's all over the place. The entire spectrum of the drug trafficking trade.
You mentioned in this book that you thought this story was the biggest story of the 21st century. And I never heard about this. I'm sure most people haven't. I mean, of course, once it goes into Netflix, it obviously be more well known. But this seems like a massive story. Like you mentioned, it has so many different implications. Even when I was trying to do research on this, most of the stuff that came up pretty much was either articles that you wrote or was referencing something that you wrote. So it doesn't really seem like this story is well known, where the FBI has its own startup and essentially wiretaps, like you say, wiretaps the world, at least the underbelly of the world. But it's pretty insane to think that no one really has heard the story.
Yeah, that someone left a kind but funny review on my book where they said basically what you just said. Like, they tried to Google for more information, they couldn't find it. I'm like, yeah, because 95% of this book is my original investigative reporting that took me years to do. I just hope that more people learn about it. I think that people don't know about it, probably for a couple of reasons, but the main one that jumps to mind is that this did primarily target criminals. Target in the loose sense, because it was such a massive honeypot all around the world. All you had to do was buy one of these phones and you would become a quote-unquote target. But when technologies target criminals, unless you're a privacy advocate or freak or journalist like me, you're probably not going to pay much attention. It's similar with stuff like Stingray is those sort of briefcase-sized devices that law enforcement can use to intercept your text messages, calls, disable phones, that sort of thing. And I don't think most people know those exist or even give them a second thought, because they assume and it's right in the majority of cases probably, that they're being used against criminals. But there's a side effect there. You deploy an IMSI catcher or a Stingray in a densely populated residential area, it can intercept text messages of everybody there. It can block all of their phones. And that's obviously just a much, much smaller honeypot in a way than Anom on a much grander scale. But I think people don't know about it because it's about people they don't really care about. And I'm not saying you need to give empathy to drug traffickers or something like that. But as we've seen with the arrest of the Telegram CEO, which is an app that, as you say, hundreds of millions of ordinary people use, Anom was a warning shot in that the FBI and other authorities are willing to go to extreme lengths to get access to encrypted communications, including running a tech startup for criminals, which almost sounds stupid when I say it out loud. It sounds like I made it up. But that's exactly what's happening now. And I think that ordinary people will start to care when it impacts more of the apps they care about. But I think it might be a little bit too late then, you know?
How many employees did Anom have working at its height?
So it had something like more than either 100 or hundreds of agents. And these are people who are selling the devices on the street. Above them, you have the big distributors. Above them, you have the main person who made Anom, a guy called Afgu. And then you have the FBI up there. So you have hundreds, or let's just say 150, just to sort of ballpark it there. With the developers who made the actual app, it was something like half a dozen front end, then you had QA testers, and then you had a project manager. So let's say maybe a dozen around there. So that's sort of the main company, I would say. But then, of course, you always have the other side of it, which is the FBI and the AFP side, because the FBI isn't just reading the messages passively as they come in. As I said, they are delivering stock sometimes. They are also deciding what features get in and what features do not. They don't want to make the phone too secure, because otherwise they're going to make a product that's actually helping the criminals rather than catching them. So then you have the organized crime squad in San Diego. That's 10, 12 people. Then you have this massive rotating cast of agents coming into San Diego just to read the messages. So, I mean, if you zoom out and take all of that, I mean, it's hundreds upon hundreds who are directly involved in this operation, which I think goes to one of your other questions about how this didn't leak. I don't know. I think it's an absolute miracle this did not leak. And some of operations did, like when they were getting close to shutting down Sky after it got hacked, some criminals did hear about it and they were telling each other, and we know that because they were saying it across Anom. So they clearly knew that Sky was compromised somehow from a leak. They didn't know Anom was compromised. And I was never told what country that sort of leak came from. The FBI and authorities didn't want to tell me that, but I think it's astounding that this didn't leak out. It ran for years, from 2019 to, 2018 actually, to 2021, and it remained a secret while it grew and grew and grew. I mean, yes, it must be due to a lot of hard work, but there's got to be luck involved in that as well.
So how many employees were just on the actual legitimate company side? You're talking about a dozen developers.
Yeah.
You had some salespeople. I mean, so you're talking a few dozen total?
Yeah, a few dozen total, relatively small. And that is also in line with the other encrypted phone companies as well. There's actually not much to do when it comes to developing or running the company. You have to be very good at it. You have to be very reliable. But once you make the app, you just fix bugs, and that's sort of what at least one of the developers I spoke to was doing. Yeah, he thought he was just working at a tech company. He didn't realize he was working for the FBI.
From a law enforcement perspective, this operation was so successful, and we're just mentioning you basically had a couple dozen employees, and in the book you talk about one of the, I think it was the tech support guys, was a person in the Philippines making $1,000 a month working on like an Upwork or Fiverr type deal, and you can silo it. And then he was shocked to find out that he was actually involved in an FBI startup. But it doesn't seem like it'd be that hard then, right? The government, especially in the US, where they can print unlimited amounts of money, I would imagine the big lesson they learned was like, hey, let's just scale this stuff up. I mean, that's at least the way I was reading it. Do you think that has been a lesson for them? And what are the implications if the answer is yes?
Yeah, I think even without knowing the exact money that the FBI spent or made, because again, they wouldn't tell me that, they clearly got their money's worth. Like the developer I was speaking to was getting something like $1,000 a month for being a key developer on like that's nothing. that's like basically wage abuse at that point, So obviously the US government can afford $1,000 a month, and if they were to ramp up, and again, I'm sure there are other operations going on in some form at this time, they would be foolish to not try this again. Now, whether the FBI wants to do it again and is trying to do it again is different to whether criminals are going to fall for it again. And at that one, I'm not entirely sure because there's so much paranoia now.
Right now, the U.S. is in an election year, so it's always a little bit crazier. But we saw the Twitter files that Elon Musk was releasing after he purchased it about all the suppression and censorship that we had during at least COVID in the U.S. And we're seeing, is it like Elon Musk is in the Twitter's or Twitter X, whatever, is not allowed in Brazil now because they weren't taking down hate speech or whatever you want to term. So it just seems like in today's day and age in 2024, if you're on any device, you should just assume you have no privacy, right? You should just assume everyone is listening in on you. And we talked about the convoluted legality of it, but they can always get through the legality. Like, so let's just run it through Lithuania. We can run it through some other country. Who knows? Maybe they team up with some country in Africa or so. I don't know. Like, there's always just some type of loophole that they can figure this out. Now, especially with the whole quote-unquote Internet of Things, aka just a bunch of devices connected to the internet, you could be having a conversation next to the refrigerator, and the smart refrigerator is communicating to maybe the FBI or whoever, or you're having a conversation around the toaster. And now with Alexa and Siri and all this stuff, it just seems like no one has any privacy. And like you're talking about a lawyer having his messages intercepted, like, I don't know. I just think like this whole thing opened a can of worms, and it just shows you if the governments want to do this, they can, because they can always find the Lithuania. They can always find the loophole.
Yeah, two things on that. 404 Media, again, the place I run during my day job where we do tech investigations, we publish a couple of pieces about something called active listening, which is where a couple of companies are saying they can target ads based on what somebody has said near a device. We don't know if that's a phone or a smart speaker or whatever. But it was for years this myth that people were sure that their apps were listening to them. And to be clear, it absolutely was a myth. Like there was no evidence. It was very circumstantial. The reason people believed it is because all of the other tracking was and is so powerful that it looks like you're being listened to. It's actually based on what you're clicking and web trackers and that sort of thing. But now it is true, which is really annoying because now we have to revisit everything and be like, are some apps actually listening to us? And like, look, as a journalist, I'm only going to go as far as the evidence allows. And I will say there are a ton of unanswered questions, but, that was shocking, basically. And then just on the other thing about how they can always find a Lithuania. And I like that term of phrase. And how I think it relates broadly to surveillance is that in the US, they have something called FISA, and this is the authorization that allows them to do this international data collection. Traditionally, it has been a counterterrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and then a counter-espionage, a lot of Russia and China stuff. Usually it's been used for that. And in recent discussions about reauthorizing that law to allow them to keep doing this, there was a lot of pushback, and the FBI pivoted, and they said, we need this to combat ransomware. So like now that's now the new threat. We're like, now this is why we have to do worldwide or very large scale collection. And that I think relates to, they always find a Lithuania comment in that they will find a new threat and a new issue to justify the collection, even if, we don't necessarily have to worry as much about Al-Qaeda or ISIS anymore. Well, now we have to worry about ransomware. So please don't take away this capability.
I forget exactly what country it was, but you were mentioning about how at some point they were getting 1 million messages a day. And then one of the countries had this advanced AI software that could just summarize the thing and kind of like connect the dots so the agents didn't have to go through all the messages. And this is, of course, before ChatGPT. So they already had this capability. But as AI advances, because ultimately, one of their biggest fears was that they would just have too much data. Well, now with AI, I don't think that would even be a fear. They couldn't actually even have enough. They could hoover up all this data, zero issues now, right? So how does AI factor into all of this?
Yeah, I believe that was the Dutch, because they have dealt with these very large data sets before and they had to filter it out. So it'll be stuff like, the AI will find out if somebody's talking about cocaine, for example. And to be fair, it actually sounds a little bit rudimentary, like find the slang word for cocaine and surface it. I'm sure it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's also not, it's not the most advanced thing in the world, but they were absolutely using it there. I think AI is going to become absolutely much more important for law enforcement. I recently reported that the Secret Service in the US bought, $50,000 worth of access to OpenAI, for example. Now, maybe they're using that to draft press releases. I don't know. But they refuse to tell me what they bought access to OpenAI for. And, maybe it's law enforcement sensitive, but I don't think it's unreasonable to ask a federal law enforcement agency, which has actually faced a lot of criticism recently for some of its failings and its operational practices. What are you using this AI for? And then even below that, you have local police using it now. There's a product called Draft One, which will automatically take the audio from footage of a body cam, and it will summarize and write the police report for them. Police apparently love it because it's very, very efficient. Prosecutors quite like it as well. Still lots of questions about accuracy, bias, whether it's going to fairly represent the views of the victim or the suspect on the other side of the body camera. And almost like I was saying, there wasn't a debate when it came to Anom. There isn't really a debate going on about AI in policing either, and that's just being rolled out. And I don't know, I guess that is just the 21st century way, right? We have all these tech companies just going and doing whatever, some great stuff, some not so good stuff. It's the same with law enforcement as well.
And you kind of just mentioned, the next threat. What do you think the next threat will be?
Well, I was yelling to anybody who would listen while I was writing this book and just shortly after release that something else is coming. Something is going to happen because all of the drug traffickers, or a lot of them, are going to Signal, are going to Telegram. They were going to Wickr until Amazon decided to shut that down because they didn't want to have to deal with all of the crime happening on there. Then I was telling people something is going to happen to a commercial app that's used by ordinary people. And then French authorities arrested the CEO of Telegram. I did not anticipate that. I'm saying I didn't anticipate all this stuff. I'm painting myself as an absolute idiot. But I did not see that. I did not think the French authorities would go that far. And it's interesting because the French military police that were involved in the investigation of the Telegram CEO were also the ones that hacked EncroChat. You can't look at the arrest of the Telegram CEO without looking at the targeting of the encrypted phone industry. So to answer your question, there's going to be more stuff like the arrest of the Telegram CEO. Now, I don't think that means they're going to go and arrest staff members of Signal necessarily, but there will be more operations or probing of commercial and consumer access encrypted messaging apps that we all use, because law enforcement aren't just going to go home and say, oh, job's done, everybody's moved to Signal or whatever. I found it interesting because I joined a press conference the other week about some other operation, and I asked Europol, hey, drug traffickers are moving to Signal, are you going to target Signal next? And the press officer for Europol deliberately, I believe, didn't read my messages and said, well, there's no more questions, so we're going to move on. And so I find it very interesting that they're not answering, are you going to target Signal next?
Yeah, I mean, talking about people being arrested, they arrested the founders of Backpage, which is similar to like a Craigslist. Did you hear about that as well? This is
a few years ago, right? Or a few weeks.
A few weeks ago, yeah. I mean, I think the paperwork's been in for years, but one of the founders killed himself. Didn't even, this is I think months ago. One of the founders whacked himself. Didn't even want to deal with it. And I think one of the other founders got, was it like 5 or 8? Maybe I forget exactly. Like 5 years in prison and millions of dollars in fines. But that would be like some person placing an ad in the New York Times for escort or stripping services, whatever, which is perfectly legal, and then propositioning them later for advanced services, so to speak. But then instead of prosecuting the person that was doing it, you're prosecuting the New York Times in this case. It seems like we're not just on the slippery slope, we're cruising down the slope.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics about that case, but I will say that Section 230, that law that allows sites like Facebook or X or whoever to not be responsible for their user content, that is facing much more backlash over the years, to the point where people are saying we should scrap it. Now, I don't know if that's a good decision or not. I think it is very good that we're able to communicate on these social media platforms. I don't know enough about that, but there is a hell of a lot of pressure for sure on companies to moderate their platforms much more aggressively. And when it comes to the Telegram CEO, to the point where they're even going to be arrested. Yeah.
And, you just mentioned your book, Dark Wire, is being adapted into a Netflix film, and Jason Bateman will be directing it. Have you had any communication with Jason Bateman? How close is this going to be to the book? Is he trying to pick your brain about how they can really get the characters as lifelike as possible, as realistic as possible?
I don't have much visibility into the process. All I will say is that I'm excited for more people to learn about it because, as we were saying earlier, nobody really knows about this story. And I do think that's a bad thing. I would also be saying that if I didn't write a book about it, obviously I have a vested interest in people knowing about it, so they buy the book. But even before that, when I was just writing articles about this case back at Motherboard, the technology section of Vice, I wanted people to know about it. I think it's vitally important. And, any adaptation, I think, would be great for that.
Today's guest has been Joseph Cox, author of the new book, Dark Wire, the incredible true story of the largest sting operation ever, which is also being adapted into a Netflix film. Just two final questions. Where can people find your book, that kind of information? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought about something that maybe we didn't cover that's really important or just something that's on your mind.
Yeah, so if you Google Dark Wire, if the SEO gods are treating me well, it should come up pretty quickly on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. Very distinctive cover. I don't think you can miss it. You can also follow my investigations work at 404media.co, where me and my three other co-founders, we publish tech investigations every single day. The only thing I'll leave you with about the book is that there's a character called Microsoft who is the most fascinating person I've ever investigated. I won't spoil it too much. All I will say is that multiple people said he was crazy. He's a very accomplished drug trafficker. And maybe he put too much trust into a device and people that he shouldn't have.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.